In 2014, a quiet family in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, became the center of a shocking and tragic story. A wife, a husband, and a respected elder in the family, three lives intertwined in ways no one could have predicted. What began as a seemingly normal family dynamic would unravel into a tale of betrayal, secrets, and a devastating crime. Samira was a wife and mother living what appeared to be a stable, comfortable life. Her husband, Faisal, worked hard, often traveling for his business, which kept the family well off. But his constant absences left an emotional gap in their marriage. While Samira managed the household and cared for their children, loneliness crept in. Over time, this loneliness would lead her down a dangerous path. Amir, Faisal's father, was a prominent figure in the family, known for his wisdom and strong presence. He often offered Samira advice and support during family gatherings. What began as innocent conversations between in-laws took a turn when Amir noticed the strain in Samira and Faisal's marriage. Instead of keeping his distance, Amir began giving Samira more attention, which grew into something far more personal. This secret connection between Samira and Amir remained hidden for years, but the truth was destined to come out. When it did, it not only destroyed the family, but also shook their entire community. What could lead a wife and a father-in-law to betray their family in such a way? And what happens when that betrayal is finally uncovered? This is the story of how one family's foundation crumbled under the weight of secrets and the devastating consequences that followed. Samira's life, at first glance, seemed picture perfect. She was married to Faisal, a successful businessman, and together they had built a home and a family in Riyadh. But the reality was far from ideal. Faisal's work kept him away for long periods, and even when he was home, his focus was often on business matters, leaving little time for Samira. Their marriage had started as an arranged union, common in their culture, and in the early years, it worked well enough. Samira and Faisal shared responsibilities and built a stable life together. But as time passed, the emotional connection between them started to fade. Faisal's frequent absences created a growing distance, and Samira found herself increasingly alone. Managing the home and raising their children became her entire world. She took on every role: wife, mother, caretaker with dedication, but it came at a cost. The lack of emotional support left her feeling isolated, and her efforts often went unnoticed. Despite her best attempts to stay strong, the emptiness in her marriage only deepened with time. This loneliness planted the seeds for what was to come. Samira's longing for connection and understanding set the stage for her growing bond with Amir, someone who seemed to notice the things Faisal no longer did. As the cracks in her marriage widened, the choices Samira would make would change her life forever. What led Samira to turn to someone outside her marriage? And how did Amir come to play such a central role in her life? The answers lie in the next part of this story. Amir was not just any family member, he was the head of the household, someone everyone looked up to. In his early 60s, he carried himself with confidence and commanded respect, not just from his family, but also from the community. His words were often seen as guidance, and his presence brought a sense of stability. However, beneath this image of a wise elder lay the beginning of a troubling story. Amir had always been kind to Samira, treating her as a daughter-in-law should be treated with respect and care. But over time, he began to notice things that others didn't. He saw how often Faisal was absent and how much Samira seemed to carry on her own. Unlike Faisal, who was distracted by work, Amir paid attention to the small details, the way Samira handled the household, or the quiet sadness in her eyes. What started as innocent family conversations began to take on a different tone. Amir's advice became more personal, and his interactions with Samira became more frequent. While he never openly acknowledged it, his admiration for her grew, and so did the time he spent seeking her company during family gatherings. Samira, for her part, found comfort in Amir's attention. He noticed her efforts, listened to her thoughts, and gave her the sense of value that she no longer felt in her marriage. Their bond, though unspoken at first, was becoming stronger with every interaction. To those around them, it seemed like a normal family relationship, but beneath the surface, it was becoming something much more complicated. How did Amir cross the line from a supportive figure to someone with a hidden agenda? And how did Samira respond as their connection deepened? The answers reveal the hidden cracks that would soon break this family apart. What started as simple conversations between Amir and Samira gradually turned into something far more personal. At first, their exchanges were brief and seemingly harmless, often occurring during family gatherings. But as time went on, the tone of their interactions began to shift. Amir, always careful and calculated, found subtle ways to linger in Samira's presence without drawing attention. For Samira, Amir's interest felt like a lifeline during a time when she felt invisible in her own marriage. His compliments, his willingness to listen, and his ability to make her feel seen became something she looked forward to. Over time, the boundaries between them started to blur. Casual glances turned into meaningful looks, and friendly conversations became deeper and more intimate. Neither of them addressed what was happening outright, but they both felt it. There was an unspoken connection that grew stronger each day. Amir began seeking out opportunities to be near Samira, offering to help with tasks around the house or finding excuses to visit when Faisal was away. Their growing bond, once innocent, was now laced with emotions neither could fully control. Samira, torn between guilt and longing, struggled with her feelings. She knew this was wrong every part of her upbringing, and faith reminded her of that, but the loneliness she felt overshadowed her better judgment. For Amir, the situation was no less complex. As the elder of the family, he knew the implications of his actions, yet he couldn't stop himself. The lines had been crossed, and their relationship was no longer just about emotional connection. But how far would they go before the weight of their choices caught up with them? Their secret was growing harder to hide, and the risks were becoming greater with every passing day. Soon, the walls around their hidden affair would start to crumble. As time passed, the connection between Amir and Samira grew deeper, and what was once subtle became more deliberate. Their interactions, carefully hidden from others, became a regular occurrence. Amir found reasons to visit Faisal's home more often, ensuring he arrived when he knew Faisal would be away. Samira, too, began to look forward to these moments, despite the guilt that gnawed at her. They grew bolder in their actions. Instead of casual encounters during family gatherings, they started meeting in private spaces, away from prying eyes. Whether it was a quiet corner of the house or a brief moment in an empty room, each meeting carried a mix of excitement and fear. The secrecy only heightened the intensity of their relationship. Samira found herself living a double life. To her family, she appeared as the same devoted wife and mother, managing the household and caring for her children. But inside, she was torn between her responsibilities and the emotions she could no longer ignore. Each time she promised herself she would end things, the pull of Amir's attention made it impossible to let go. Amir, on the other hand, had become more confident in his actions. He reassured Samira that their relationship was harmless, just two people finding comfort in each other. But deep down, both knew that their bond had crossed a line that could never be undone. The weight of their secret began to affect Samira more visibly, making it harder for her to maintain the facade of normalcy. Their growing recklessness brought them closer to the edge. The risk of being caught was always there, but they convinced themselves they could keep the affair hidden. What they didn't realize was that their behavior was starting to draw attention. The foundation of their carefully built secret was beginning to crack, setting the stage for the consequences that would soon follow. Faisal was a man who trusted his family completely, but even he couldn't ignore the subtle changes happening around him. Samira, once attentive and engaged, seemed distracted. Her usual warmth was gone, replaced by a distant demeanor that left Faisal uneasy. She avoided meaningful conversations, often retreating early to their bedroom with excuses of exhaustion. At first, Faisal brushed it off as the stress of managing the household alone. His frequent business trips were undoubtedly a burden, and he blamed himself for not being around more often. But over time, the changes in Samira's behavior became too noticeable to ignore. Her once natural laughter now felt forced, and she seemed preoccupied, lost in her own thoughts. Family members, too, began to pick up on subtle tensions. Faisal's younger sister mentioned noticing strange glances between Samira and Amir during family gatherings. Though Faisal dismissed these concerns initially, they planted a seed of doubt in his mind. He began to watch more closely, paying attention to the small details he had previously overlooked. It wasn't just Samira's actions that caught his attention. Amir's increased visits to their home, particularly when Faisal was away, started to feel unusual. Faisal couldn't put his finger on it, but something about the timing and frequency of Amir's presence made him uneasy. What were once innocent gestures now seemed deliberate. Faisal's growing suspicions didn't lead to immediate confrontation. Instead, he began observing quietly, piecing together fragments of behavior that didn't add up. He noticed how Samira guarded her phone more than usual, how she seemed uneasy when he asked about her day. Though he wanted to believe it was nothing, his instincts told him otherwise. The doubt ate away at him, but Faisal chose to wait. He needed proof before he could act. The cracks in his trust were widening, and soon the weight of his suspicions would push him to uncover the truth. What he would find would shatter his world in ways he could never have imagined. Faisal's quiet observations soon led him to take action. One evening, while Samira was out running errands, he decided to check her phone, a step he had never taken before. What he found was undeniable. Hidden among mundane messages were conversations between Samira and Amir that left no room for doubt. The words confirmed what Faisal had been fearing. His wife and father had been involved in an affair. The discovery hit Faisal like a wave, drowning him in anger and disbelief. This was not just a betrayal by his wife, but also by the man he had looked up to his entire life. For a moment, Faisal couldn't move, his hands frozen as he scrolled through the messages that revealed years of deceit. Each word felt like a dagger, cutting deeper into the trust he had once had in both of them. Despite the fury raging within him, Faisal didn't immediately confront Samira. He chose to wait, allowing the shock to settle and planning his next steps carefully. He needed to be sure of how he would handle the situation, as this wasn't just a matter of broken trust, it was a betrayal that involved his family's honor and reputation. The weight of the secret became too much to bear. Faisal began to look at Samira differently, his every interaction with her now laced with suspicion. Her smallest actions, an innocent glance at her phone, a hurried excuse to leave the room, only fueled his anger. At the same time, his relationship with Amir became strained, though he managed to keep his emotions in check for the moment. Faisal knew that once the truth was out, there would be no going back. The family he had worked so hard to protect was about to be torn apart. The calm before the storm was nearly over, and the confrontation he was building toward would change all their lives forever. What would Faisal do with this knowledge? And how would Samira and Amir respond when the truth was finally brought to light? The unraveling of their secret was only beginning. The night Faisal's suspicions turned into reality was one that would haunt the family forever. After weeks of silently observing and gathering evidence, Faisal returned home unexpectedly from a business trip. The house was eerily quiet, with the children staying at his sister's home for the night. But Faisal wasn't alone. He heard muffled voices coming from the guest room, a place usually reserved for Amir during his visits. As Faisal approached the room, his heart raced with a mixture of dread and fury. The door was slightly ajar, and as he peered inside, his worst fears were confirmed. There, in front of him, was Samira and Amir in an intimate embrace. The scene hit Faisal like a thunderbolt, his world shattering in an instant. The betrayal he had suspected for so long was now undeniable. In that moment, rage overtook him. He burst into the room, his voice shaking with fury as he confronted them. The betrayal by his wife and his father, the two people he trusted the most, was too much to bear. Samira froze, her face pale, while Amir struggled to find words to explain the inexcusable. Faisal's anger boiled over into violence. Grabbing a decorative knife from the wall, he attacked Amir in a fit of uncontrollable rage. Years of pent-up frustration and betrayal fueled every strike, and within moments, Amir collapsed to the floor. Blood pooled around him, the room falling into a deadly silence as Samira screamed in horror. Faisal, breathing heavily and consumed by the enormity of what he had done, dropped the knife and sank to the floor. The weight of his actions began to settle on him, but the emotions, anger, heartbreak, humiliation were still raw and overpowering. Samira could only stand frozen, the reality of the situation sinking in as the man she once called her father-in-law lay lifeless on the ground. The tragedy that unfolded in that room was the culmination of years of hidden emotions and secrets. What had started as a betrayal between two people had now escalated into a crime that would destroy the entire family. The next steps, involving the authorities, the community, and the aftermath of this act, would only deepen the scars that were left behind. This was the moment everything changed. The family would never recover from what happened that night. In the hours following the confrontation, the police arrived at Faisal's home, responding to calls from neighbors who heard Samira's screams. The scene they walked into was one of chaos and heartbreak. Amir's lifeless body lay on the floor, and Faisal sat beside him, covered in blood and staring blankly into space. Samira, still in shock, was unable to speak coherently as the officers tried to piece together what had happened. Faisal was taken into custody that night, his actions already clear to the authorities. The investigation moved quickly. Statements from Samira, the evidence at the scene, and Faisal's own admission left no doubt about what had occurred. He confessed to the murder, but his explanation was rooted in the betrayal he had endured, betrayal from the two people he had trusted most. The community was stunned as news of the crime spread. Faisal, once a respected businessman and a loving husband and father in the eyes of many, was now a central figure in a scandal that rocked his family and their standing in society. But as the details emerged, the affair between Amir and Samira became the focus of discussions. While Faisal's crime was undeniable, many began to sympathize with the emotional torment that had driven him to such an act. During the trial, Faisal's lawyers argued that he acted in the heat of the moment, overwhelmed by the betrayal and humiliation he had faced. Under Sharia law, the court considered the circumstances, acknowledging the emotional toll that led to his actions. While Faisal was found guilty of murder, the court showed leniency, sentencing him to 15 years in prison rather than the death penalty. Faisal accepted the punishment without protest. His time in court was not one of defiance, but of quiet acceptance. For him, the weight of his actions and the betrayal that caused them was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. Though his sentence marked a legal closure to the crime, the emotional fallout was far from over. The family's once strong foundation had been irreparably damaged, and the consequences of that night would continue to ripple through their lives. As the investigation into the tragic events unfolded, Samira found herself under intense scrutiny. The affair with Amir, which had remained a secret for years, was now exposed for all to see. The once respected wife and mother now faced the judgment of both the courts and the community. Her betrayal was viewed as the root cause of the tragedy, and she quickly became a target of public outrage. During questioning, Samira admitted to her role in the affair, but claimed it was never intended to hurt anyone. She spoke of her loneliness, her longing for connection, and how Amir's attention had filled a void in her life. But these explanations did little to sway the court or the public. To many, her actions represented a betrayal of trust so severe that they could not be forgiven. The court, taking Faisal's plea for leniency into account, sentenced Samira to 10 years in prison. Faisal, despite his anger and heartbreak, had asked the court to spare her life, recognizing that the situation was as much a tragedy as it was a crime. This act of mercy surprised many, but it did not absolve Samira of her role in the events that led to Amir's death. Samira's sentence marked the beginning of a new chapter of isolation and reflection. In prison, she was left to face the consequences of her choices, cut off from her children and the life she once knew. The community, once supportive of her family, turned its back on her completely. She became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the devastating effects of betrayal. The punishment handed down to Samira was not just legal, it was social and emotional as well. Her reputation was destroyed, her relationships irreparably damaged, and her future uncertain. Yet, the story was far from over. While Samira served her sentence, the pain she caused continued to ripple through the family she left behind, ensuring the scars of her actions would never fully heal. The ripple effects of the affair and the tragic events that followed extended far beyond the family. In Riyadh, where family honor and community respect hold significant value, the story quickly became the center of attention. Whispers of betrayal, scandal, and murder spread through the community, tarnishing the family's once respected reputation. For years, Faisal and his family had been seen as a symbol of stability and success. Faisal's work as a businessman had earned him admiration, and Amir was regarded as a wise and honorable elder. Samira, too, had been seen as a devoted wife and mother. But after the affair and its devastating consequences came to light, all of that changed. The community's reaction was harsh. Friends and extended family distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Amir's betrayal of his son shocked many, but it was Samira's actions that drew the most condemnation. In the eyes of the community, her role in the affair had set the stage for the tragedy, and the blame rested squarely on her shoulders. Faisal, despite being the one who committed the murder, found unexpected sympathy from some. Many saw him as a man who had been pushed to his breaking point by the betrayal of those closest to him. Others, however, viewed him as a man who had destroyed his family's legacy with an act of violence that could never be undone. The fallout didn't just affect Faisal, Samira, and Amir's immediate family. Their children, too young to understand the full extent of what had happened, became the silent victims. They were left to navigate a world where their family name now carried the weight of shame and sorrow. The community's judgment ensured that their lives would never be the same. The story of this family's downfall became a cautionary tale in the community, a reminder of the consequences of broken trust and unchecked emotions. But as time passed, the memory of what had happened faded for most. For the family, however, the scars remained, serving as a permanent reminder of the tragedy that had forever altered their lives. The events that unfolded left the family shattered in ways that words could barely describe. What was once a household built on tradition, respect, and unity had crumbled under the weight of betrayal and tragedy. The murder of Amir was not just the loss of a family member, but a devastating blow to the family's foundation, one that could never be repaired. For Faisal, the impact was both emotional and personal. The man who once embodied strength and leadership in his family now bore the label of a convicted murderer. The weight of killing his own father, a man he had respected and loved despite his flaws, haunted him daily. Even in prison, Faisal struggled to reconcile his actions. His rage fueled by the betrayal, yet tempered by the regret of losing everything he once held dear. Samira, though alive, faced a different kind of loss. The years in prison meant she was separated from her children, her home, and the life she had built. The bond she shared with her children was irreparably broken, as they were too young to fully understand what had happened. For them, their mother became a distant figure associated with shame and heartbreak. The children, left in the care of extended family, faced a challenging reality. They were burdened by the whispers and judgment that followed them wherever they went. The story of their parents' betrayal and the murder that followed became a shadow they could not escape. Their childhood, once filled with innocence, was now marked by loss and confusion. The extended family, too, suffered. Relationships that had once been strong grew strained or severed entirely. Family gatherings became a thing of the past, replaced by silence and distance. The bonds that had connected relatives were frayed by the shame and grief of what had occurred. This tragedy did more than break individuals, it dismantled an entire family structure. What had taken decades to build was undone in the span of a few years. While time might eventually dull the sharpness of their pain, the scars left behind ensured that the family could never return to what it once was. This was the price of betrayal, and its cost would be felt for generations. Faisal's time in prison was not just a punishment for his crime, but also a period of deep emotional turmoil. Stripped of his freedom and separated from his children, he was left with nothing but his thoughts and the heavy burden of what had transpired. The betrayal by his father and wife, combined with the violent act he committed in response, weighed on him every single day. Inside his prison cell, Faisal replayed the events leading up to that night over and over again. The discovery of the affair, the confrontation, and the rage that consumed him all haunted him like a recurring nightmare. While he had acted in the heat of the moment, the guilt of taking his father's life could not be erased. Amir was not just the man he had trusted, but also the person who had raised him. That connection, now severed by his own hands, left an emotional scar that refused to heal. Faisal's feelings towards Samira were equally complicated. While anger and betrayal dominated his thoughts initially, there were moments when he felt a deep sadness for what they had lost. Despite her role in the affair, she was still the mother of his children and the woman he had once built a life with. Yet, the thought of forgiveness felt impossible as the pain she caused remained fresh. Prison became a place of isolation for Faisal, not just physically, but emotionally. The support of family and friends dwindled. leaving him to navigate his struggles alone. Even in moments of reflection, when he tried to make sense of everything, there were no answers that could bring him peace. He had lost not only his father and wife, but also the sense of identity and purpose that once defined him. The years stretched on, and while Faisal adjusted to the routine of prison life, the emotional weight never lessened. His sentence might have had an end date, but the grief, guilt, and loss he carried would follow him far beyond those prison walls. For Faisal, the punishment was not just the time served, it was the lifetime of regret that came with it. Samira's life behind bars was a stark contrast to the one she had known before. Gone were the days of managing her household and caring for her children. Now, her world was confined to a small cell where every day was a reminder of the choices that led to her downfall. For someone who once had the respect of her family and community, the isolation was almost unbearable. Separated from her children, Samira felt the loss deeply. She often thought of their faces, their laughter, and the life they once shared. The knowledge that they were growing up without her filled her with regret. She wondered how they would see her in the future. Would they ever forgive her? Or would she always be the mother who brought shame to their name? The loneliness forced Samira to confront the decisions that led her to this point. She reflected on the emotional void that had driven her into Amir's arms, the moments she could have walked away but didn't, and the lies she told herself to justify her actions. At times, she struggled to understand how everything had spiraled so far out of control. What had started as a search for connection had turned into a series of betrayals with devastating consequences. Samira also bore the weight of society's judgment. In the eyes of the community, she was the catalyst for the tragedy that destroyed her family. She was not just a woman who had strayed, but a symbol of betrayal and dishonor. Even within the prison walls, whispers of her story followed her, making her isolation even more profound. Despite the overwhelming shame, there were moments when Samira tried to find solace. She prayed for forgiveness, not just from God, but also from Faisal and her children. She hoped that one day she might rebuild some semblance of a relationship with them, even if forgiveness seemed impossible now. The years in prison stretched out ahead of her, and Samira understood that her punishment wasn't just the time she would serve. It was the lifetime of estrangement, regret, and loss that would follow her. The tragedy that unfolded within this family serves as a powerful reminder of how easily trust can be broken and the far-reaching consequences of betrayal. What began as small, hidden actions spiraled into events that shattered lives and destroyed relationships, leaving nothing but pain and regret in their wake. This was not just a story of an affair or a single act of violence. It was a story of how unchecked emotions and decisions can unravel even the strongest of foundations. For Faisal, Emir, and Samira, the choices they made will forever define their lives. Faisal's rage, though understandable to some, cost him his freedom and left him carrying the heavy weight of guilt. Samira, seeking solace in the wrong place, lost her family, her reputation, and the life she had worked so hard to build. And Amir, whose actions betrayed the very values he stood for, paid with his life. This story is also a cautionary tale for others. It highlights how unresolved emotional needs, when ignored or mishandled, can lead people to make decisions that harm not only themselves but everyone around them. It's a painful example of how a single betrayal can ripple outward, affecting children, extended family, and even the broader community. In the end, no one emerged unscathed. The family, once respected and admired, was left in ruins. The community, once supportive, turned its back on them. and the individuals at the heart of the story were left to face the consequences of their actions alone. As we reflect on this tragedy, we are reminded of the importance of trust, communication, and self-control. Betrayal may bring a fleeting sense of fulfillment, but its price is often far greater than anyone can imagine. This family story stands as a somber warning of what can happen when emotions are allowed to overpower reason, and secrets are left to fester until it's too late.